Reading with your kids.
Hola, ni hao, konnichiwa, assalamu alaikum, shalom, jambo, bienvenidos. Hi, my name is Jadley, and this is the Reading with Your Kids podcast, an iHeartRadio Best Kids and Family Podcast Award nominee. We are here to inspire families to grow closer together by reading more together. We're so happy that you are part of our beautiful Reading with Your Kids family. Please be sure to subscribe to the show on the iHeartRadio app, on Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, wherever you find your podcast. Our guest today is Lucinda Robb. She is here to celebrate a really timely book. It's called The Suffragist Playbook, your guide to changing the world. Right now, please welcome to the show, Lucinda Robb. Lucinda, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me today.
I'm excited to have you today. I mean, we're talking about empowering kids to change the world. What can be more important than that?
I think this is exactly what we want to teach kids. You know, your civic responsibility is to try to keep on pushing ahead with making a more perfect union. And looking at the suffrage movement is a great way to see examples of that.
Yeah. You know, you brought up that term, more perfect union, and there have been so many comedians who've like, well, how can you improve on perfection and all that kind of stuff? But, you know, no matter how great we think our country is and wherever our country is, we can still work to make it better because nothing is perfect. And there are always people out there who are going to need support and help. And I love that idea that we can just help our kids understand that, yes, they have the power to make this happen.
Well, and also, one of the things when you talk about it, you know, there are new problems coming along in life all the time. Things that, you know, the original founders never would have thought about. I mean, you can't, you know, Thomas Jefferson never said, well, what's my internet policy? You know, things are changing. We have to figure out how to adapt. We have to figure out what we do right. It is something where I think that's what makes democracy so vital, that people really participate as much as possible in the system. And that's why I think suffrage is such an interesting thing to study, because when they passed the 19th Amendment, it's the largest expansion of suffrage in U.S. history. Moved the most people onto the voting rolls than ever before. It took a long time. It wasn't easy to do. But it did open up the benefits of democracy. And because being able to vote is really kind of a stand-in for being a full citizen, it really made a big difference for a huge number of people.
Yeah. So if you're not aware of it, what we're referring to is the suffragist movement that gave women the right to vote. And it didn't happen overnight.
No, it didn't. You know, my children are aghast when I tell them that when my grandmother was born, women did not have the right to vote where she lived in Texas. Some states had it, some states didn't. She was born in 1912. The suffrage movement is traditionally sort of envisioned as having started back in 1848 at Seneca Falls, when a group of women got together and created a Declaration of Sentiments that they brought together, and they were going to have the very first women's rights convention. And they didn't know how many people were going to show up. They were literally a small group of Quaker ladies and Elizabeth Cady Stanton got together for a tea party, and they thought, well, you know, let's have let's have a women's rights convention. And 300 people showed up. And they had this list of resolutions, and one of them was that women should have the right to vote. And that was the first time that any publicly put down in writing and people voted on it that this is something women should have. And it took a long time to pass. It was not easy. Like I said, my kids can't believe there's a time that women couldn't vote, but there was. And it's one of those things that as part of making a perfect union, you work at constantly.
Mm-hmm. And we're not talking that long ago either. We're kind of 2 lifetimes ago.
Yeah, this is the actual anniversary of the 19th Amendment was this past August 26th, and it was the 100th anniversary. And the suffrage movement itself took about 70 plus years and 3 generations. Most people, if they've heard of any suffragists, have heard of Susan B. Anthony. Well, Susan B. Anthony was one of the first leaders, not the very first, but one of the first. And she was 86 when she died, and she still didn't live to see, and she lived a long life, and she didn't live to see suffrage pass. So it is sort of, a lot of times activists today think things aren't happening fast enough. Well, it's almost never happening as fast as you would like it to happen. But that's sort of an example of how a lot of change is gradual. But at the same time, when women were first looking at the right to vote, and this is something that, sort of shocked me. Back in 1848, back in the 1840s, women weren't even supposed to speak in public. That was wildly controversial. They'd be denounced from the pulpit. And this wasn't something that women did at all. In fact, not only were women not supposed to speak in public, there weren't laws against it, but it was sort of the social norms. Women weren't even supposed to applaud in public. They couldn't clap. So instead, it's interesting, you read about it as late as the 1880s and 1890s. They talk about gatherings where you have a women speaker, and then you say, and everyone waved their handkerchiefs. That's what you would do. It was a silent, quiet way of showing approval. They used to call it the Chautauqua salute. But back when this began, not only did women not have the right to vote, they didn't speak in public. Very, very few, if any, colleges were open to women. Oberlin was the first one in the U.S. that allowed women to go, and there were just a handful of women there. Most of the professions were closed to women. Pretty much women, you could be a teacher, you could be a seamstress, and even if you did the exact same job that a man did as a teacher, if you took over from a male teacher and you did the same job and parents all liked you better, you still got paid half the amount that they made, even though, as other people would point out, it's not like the baker charged you less for bread. Married women didn't have the right to their own property. It was a lot of laws sort of essentially considered women as legally dead once they got married. So a lot of things changed along with suffrage in that period of time, the 72 years before women got the 19th Amendment. But it was a gradual thing.
What you just said blows me away. This idea that a woman was essentially legally dead when she got married, that is so alien, and it's upside down to the way I think. When my wife and I were married 30 years ago, but 30 years ago, we both came alive. Our lives changed in this wonderful way. To think that 100 plus years ago that she would have been considered legally dead, that's really is mind-blowing to me.
One of the earliest suffragists, Lucy Stone, started out as an abolitionist. And this is what happens with a lot of people who get involved in causes. You get involved in one cause and you sort of, it's almost your apprenticeship. You learn how to do it. You learn what roles you can play. You learn how to engage in the public debate. And then as she started talking about what had happened to enslaved people, particularly the moving stories for her was what had happened to enslaved women. And then she starts thinking, well, what is happening to women in general? And her own life had been pretty tough and had a lot of struggles. And she was one of those first women to go to Oberlin College. So when first a suitor came along and wanted to marry her, she for a long time turned him down because she thought, she was going to spend all of her life working on abolitionism and later on women's rights. And he pursued her, Henry Blackwell, pursued her for several years. And in the end, when they got married, they published their vows, and they had their own unique vows where he said, I will not take away any of your rights. And this was considered, this was a wild thing to do. It was very radical, but a lot of people were, invigorated by too. She was one of the first women to keep her own name, and they both together worked on a lot of these causes. In fact, Henry Blackwell was very active in the American Women's Suffrage Association, which she helped found, and then also later on after her death in the National American Women's Suffrage Association. My mom calls it all the, NWSA and AWSA and NASA, and it's all the alphabet letters. But, he became one of the allies for women's suffrage and was invested in it in his entire life. So it is interesting sort of how that began too.
It sounds like at the base of change, at the base of suffrage, was this empathy that people had for others, seeing the suffering of others, and that opened up their people's eyes to some of the things that they were suffering and wanting to make that change.
Very much so. I think particularly most of the early abolitionists, or most of the early suffragists, were abolitionists. And again, there were several men who had been abolitionists who were strong supporters of women's suffrage. It didn't directly impact them, but they felt it was an important thing to do. Frederick Douglass, in fact, was instrumental and one of the first suffragists, and he stood up at Seneca Falls when it looked like Elizabeth Cady Stanton's controversial resolution that women should have the vote wasn't going to pass. He stood up and spoke in favor of it. And he was a famous abolitionist and journalist, and he said, having been enslaved, he knew what it was like not to have power. And his words really carried the day. So that kind of empathy was important. And in fact, we talk a lot about allies today. That was one of the things that the suffrage movement did throughout its entire history, was recruit allies, particularly towards the end, because, there's no way that women could vote. Not a single woman was able to vote for suffrage herself. They had to convince and persuade men that this was something to do. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an interesting aspect. We talk about a lot of the other First Amendment rights, but a lot of it really is messaging, a lot of it is persuasion, and a lot of it, practically speaking, is convincing people why this is good for everyone as a whole. Mm-hmm. One of my favorite examples that we talk about in the book is someone that almost no one has ever heard of today. Her name was Frances Willard. She was the president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, so against alcohol. It was the largest women's organization in the United States, probably in the world. And she headed it up for 20 years, from 1879 to 1898. She was one of the most famous women in her day. I like to say she's sort of a cross between maybe Oprah and Dolly Parton. I mean, she was huge. When she died unexpectedly of the flu, talking about statues, she was the first woman to get a statue in Statuary Hall. And she would not be joined by another woman for 50 years in the United States Capitol Statuary Hall. She wouldn't be joined by another woman for 50 years. She was huge in her day. And what she did was to convince people that the reason why that they needed to get behind suffrage and support it was not just because it was morally the right thing to do, although she very much believed that, but because there was a lot of good that you could do with it. Mm-hmm. So she talked about it as the home protection ballot and citizen motherhood. And she made a point of saying, look, if women get the vote, we can do these things that are going to help protect our families. We can vote in temperance legislation. We can vote for public health and sanitation. We can vote for labor reform, anti-drug and anti-tobacco, and education, and things like raising the age of consent. And these were things that got a lot of people who maybe they'd heard of suffrage and the idea that women should vote, but maybe it wasn't their top 20 issues that they cared about, mm-hmm. In the 19th century. And she managed to convince a lot of women and men that this was something important because of the good that they could do with it.
Yeah. I can't imagine life without all of the strong, incredible women that are not only in my life, but in public life and making a difference today. Talk about a different world. I don't even want to imagine. It would be a horrible time.
Well, it's one of the, I think, things that was really fun about doing this book was getting to know some of these women through their stories. And that's how we really tried to write it. We wanted to talk about the actual tactics that they used. What are the practical ways that you make change happen? And we wanted to do it through storytelling because that's the way you really remember things. I mean, I think, whenever you want to tell a story, traditionally in history, whether it's, the Book of Exodus or the Ramayana or the Iliad, the way you pass information on is through stories. So we tell the stories of these women, and in writing them and getting to know them and spend time with them, it's almost like they're old school friends that you had. Maybe you haven't seen them in a while, but you feel like you really you know them. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, I talked about her earlier. She was one of the sort of big thinkers and brains. She was kind of the Thomas Jefferson of the suffrage movement, and she had 7 kids. And I always think about her because she had her last child at 43, wow. And he weighed 12 pounds. And I think, wow, that's really, she's doing a lot of this writing of the ideas and the speeches and the things from the suffrage movement while she's at home. Susan B. Anthony would come to her house and help take care of the speeches that Susan B. Anthony would go out and give all over the country. Susan B. Anthony, there's a reason why people remember her. Mm-hmm. She traveled extensively in her lifetime. She estimates that probably in a 40-year period, she gave anywhere from 75 to 100 speeches a year, traveling back and forth across the country. And again, this is before airplanes. So she would have had platinum status today on every airline. But back then, she's doing it in trains, she's doing it in wagons, she's doing it in horse and occasionally sleigh and mule and boat and things like that. She's getting around talking nonstop about suffrage and getting that word out. And so you wind up having all these amazing examples like Sojourner Truth, someone who, really created a life. She had an incredibly difficult hand. She was born enslaved in New York. Most people don't know there was slavery in New York. And even when she finally became free, when New York gradually had a system where instead of letting everybody free at once, they did it in sort of steps and stages. So her children were still enslaved when she was free. And that really changes how you can do things and what you can get involved in. But she wound up, despite having all these this tough hand and these strikes against her, she never learned to read or write. She did memorize the Bible. She had children read passages to her because she just wanted to learn the words. A lot of adults give editorial content, and she wanted to learn the book itself. But she would go around as a public speaker. She dictated a autobiography, which she used to be able to support herself and her family in going out and speaking about abolitionism and speaking about women's suffrage and speaking about, she was in temperance as well. And after the Civil War, I'm from Arlington, Virginia. She was here in Arlington trying to help the freedmen. In fact, that's a cause that she donated some of her hard-earned money to that cause to try to help. And so there are all these fantastic, wonderful, fun, flawed women that we've had a chance to study, and that's just been a blast. It's been fun finding out what they've done and sort of seeing, modern parallels today, what young people are doing.
Yeah. Now, we said that this was a book for young adults, and I think it's a great book for young adults, kids in middle school. I think it's important for adults to read. Talk a little bit. I wouldn't just want to give this book to my high school daughter or son, because I think it's important for young men to read it too. This, I think, is a book that I think is really important for parents and kids to read together and to talk about, because our kids have people in their lives talking to them about making changes and getting out there and having their voice heard. But those adults may not be advising our kids to speak in the way that we would choose to have them speak and get engaged in public. Just talk about the importance for families to talk about this stuff together, please.
Well, I got to tell you, I'll let you in on a secret. Not only did I have my 2 oldest children, I have a 14-year-old daughter, a 13-year-old son, and an 11-year-old son. And my 14-year-old and 13-year-old, when we started this book, they were a couple of years younger, but they actually read every draft of every chapter that we did, and were giving me feedback. And occasionally, particularly my 14-year-old would say, "Mom, nobody talks like that." Whenever I try to be too cool. But yeah, I find that in having this discussion with them, and we talk about what are the issues that we care about, what are the things that are important, and in fact, we we even, we do a Valentine's Day card every year because I'm never organized enough to get it out for the holidays. So I do a Valentine's Day card, and every year we have a theme. And after we did this, we decided our theme was going to be, things you care about. So in the card, the kids all made posters for issues that were important to them. So one of them, it was really important about the arts, because my oldest is really involved in acting and drama and things like that, in supporting the arts. And my middle child cares about equality. And my youngest child was all about, let's save the pets. So it became a way for us to say, what are the issues that you care about that are important to you? And how, reading and looking at these stories, what are the ways you think you can best accomplish that? Because, not everyone is going to be the right person to be speaking in front of a crowd. Some people, the right thing that they can do is be writing letters and supporting in other ways. There's not just one way. We talk a lot in the book about the perceived radicals and moderates, and what we would call the radicals of the suffrage movement. We're not, in fact, all that radical. As my co-author Becca likes to point out, in Britain, the suffragettes, and that was a pejorative term, which they sort of took on as their own. The suffragettes really were pretty crazy. They threatened to burn down Parliament, and they would go around slapping policemen, and they brought it. Mm-hmm. The suffragists here in the United States were not nearly nothing like that. They didn't break any laws. The suffragists who were arrested in front of the White House for picketing, they basically had to make up a charge. They said obstructing traffic on the sidewalk. And nobody, in fact, ever they got sent to jail, but they never actually successfully got charged for any of it, because this was made up. It was just that they were embarrassing Woodrow Wilson with signs outside the White House. Suffragists were the very first people to do that. Now it's completely modern day. I guarantee, anytime you go to D.C., you'll see, somebody protesting in front of the White House. But back then, they were the very first people to do that. They were the first people to march in Washington for a specific cause, with the 1913 suffrage parade and all of these things that they did. But the things that those suffragists did, who they were considered radical, what they did was move the goalpost. Mm-hmm. They got the attention. They got the focus. But you had another group of suffragists, the moderates, who were part of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, represented a much wider group of people, much larger group of women and men. They were definitely men involved in those movements. And their role was, once people are paying attention, to go in and to be able to do the lobbying and to say, this is why we think you should do it, and to build up the relationships and have that state-by-state relationship with all the different legislatures when you're passing an amendment. Because amendments is the toughest way, that is the Hawaiian Kona Iron Man of legislation. It's really tough to do, to triathlon, to get an amendment. There's a reason why we have so few amendments to the Constitution. So you have a role for both moderates and radicals, and who you think is moderate and radical will change over time, and what role you play really kind of depends on what you care about, what's important to you, and what way you best think you can serve that cause.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So important, and it's the American way. What you're celebrating is American, what America was built on. Just the idea that we all have a voice, and we can all work to enrich each other's lives, and it's wonderful. What drew you to this? Because this was a big project, and it's one thing to be interested in a movement and to admire folks and to study it. It's another to actually get down and to do the work to create a book like this. What inspired you?
Well, I used to work at the National Archives in D.C., and when I was there, it was actually the 75th anniversary of suffrage, and I've been involved in a project called Women's Petitions to Congress from 1789 to 1920. And I was surprised to find this huge number of petitions that women had sent in throughout that time period. They were enormous. I mean, I remember one time we found this petition that had been signed by 37,000 women. And this is back in the 1830s. And I'm thinking, I had no idea. I can't imagine one petition signed by that many people. Today, before COVID, I thought, well, maybe they'll go stand outside of, Walmart or something where there's a lot of people coming in and out and you can get a bunch of signatures. How did they get that many people back then? How did that many women get involved? It was such a big, it was an anti-slavery petition, such a big anti-slavery petition that literally when they brought it into Congress, they didn't unwrap it. They weighed it, the weight of public opinion. And we found hundreds of thousands of petitions from women on all these different issues. And we did our own commemoration of the 75th anniversary while we were there. So as, about 3 years out, as we're getting ready for the 100th anniversary, I was talking with some friends and I said, I'm really excited to see what's going to happen for this 100th anniversary. And, this is such an important role, and how many times you get to celebrate specifically women's achievement. This is kind of really, very nice and exciting. And I had a really good friend of mine kind of look at me and say, she said, I know nothing about the suffrage movement. She said, I couldn't name one suffragist. And I realized talking to friends that wasn't unusual. A lot of times, when I was growing up, the history books mostly, there are a lot of wars going on, and we spend a lot of time on wars, and battles and generals. In fact, I think that here in Virginia, there are people who could probably name more horses in the Civil War than actually suffragists. So we thought, well, let's make something that's really fun, that's digestible, that people can enjoy. And originally, my thought was to do a graphic novel. And I talked to Becca about it. My co-author had written a book about the women's suffrage parade in D.C. in 1913. And I really know a lot about the 19th century. And she really was a specialist in the 20th century. We thought, well, let's do this graphic novel or something together. And then we discovered, we pitched it to a publisher. We got Candlewick as our publisher. And then we realized it was going to take way too long to do all of that, the drawings and things like that. And even then, we were just down to the wire, and then everything happened with COVID. But we wanted to make something that was easy, that was fun, that was memorable, that would really, and not just be about a whole long list of dates and a whole long list of this place happened there and this place happened there. We wanted to explain, why is history relevant? Why does it matter? And for us, looking at everything that was happening in the world, the suffrage movement was incredibly relevant because it really was, for us, sort of a guidebook or just saying, this is how you can make change in a positive way without violent social upheaval, which, we think is a plus. And also the thing is, the suffragists won. They did get the 19th Amendment, and it didn't do everything. We know, unfortunately, that there were still Jim Crow laws in the South, which kept a lot of black women and black men from voting in the South. And so it really was more of a rung on this ladder of, constantly going towards that more perfect union. But it was a big, important role. And now more women vote than men. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In fact, I don't know for this election when they'll come up with the exact numbers, but for 2016, you had 10 million more women vote than men.
Yeah. And I think the same is true in colleges. I believe that there are more women in colleges now than there are men. And 100 years ago was, women weren't allowed to go to college.
You're absolutely right. It's all of these things change. We become the new norm. I mean, and I think some of them happen the reverse. You now have more men who are spending time with their kids and reading books to them and changing diapers and, having that really invested, being great things around the house and cooks and playing different roles. I think a lot of that we sort of adapt and we figure out, how can we do this that works for everybody? So it's, Lucy Stone, towards the end of her life, she also did not live to see the 19th Amendment or suffrage. And at one point she wrote something called, 40 years, achievements of 40 years, and then she winds up writing the achievement of 50 years, and they still didn't happen. But in it, she talks about how when she first started talking about, speaking out about suffrage, and again, wildly controversial, literally they had ducking stools. It's kind of like waterboarding for women. Women had so few rights, and so many gradually things happened and changed. And, the first place that women got the right to vote was in Wyoming, first as a territory and then as a state. And one of the great advantages is you could look at it and you say, you know what? Everything did not fall apart because women had the right to vote. In fact, it seemed to work perfectly fine. Utah was the second territory. It was the not quite the second state, but they had a lot of women in Utah. In Wyoming, it was still way more men than women when they changed the laws there. But as the western states start adding more women voters and the whole thing doesn't fall apart, people realize this really is going to work. It used to be one of the arguments, they said, was that the polls were such nasty places that no well-respected, woman would want to go there. And actually, there's some truth to that. There was a lot of drinking. There was a lot of behavior that we would it was kind of like a big, huge frat party. And they weren't respectable places. But once women started going to the polls, they became sort of wonderfully boring. They cleaned up their act.
It sounds like polling places wouldn't have been someplace I would have wanted to hang out at this point in my life.
Well, they definitely had an interesting reputation back before, a couple hundred years ago.
Yeah. Is there one person in that you researched, that you speak about in the book, that is your favorite?
Oh, well, I think I've told you about three that I really love. But the truth is, I think Frances Willard, just because she's so unknown today, but as someone who has watched politics all my life, and I have a sort of a sense of, not just that it happens, how do you make things work? And she was so good at marketing and so good at branding. I really find her fascinating, and the fact that she was able to persuade her mostly conservative white evangelical voters that this was something people should get behind. I find her kind of fascinating. I do find, I mentioned Elizabeth Cady Stanton earlier, and speaking of reading, I'll read one quick letter that she writes at one point that I really sympathize with, today, and I think may sound familiar to anyone who's trying to go through the situation we're in right now. And she says, to keep the house and grounds in good order, purchase every article of clothing for daily use, keep the wardrobes of half a dozen human beings in proper trim, take the children to dentists, shoemakers, and different scholars or fine teachers at home, altogether made sufficient work to keep one brain busy, as well as all the hands that I could impress into service. Now, that sounds like a lot of parents today to me. I mean, I didn't even know they had dentists back then. but you never hear about, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson thinking, what do I do with child care? And I think that's, they're living a real life with their families right there, and that makes it kind of fun for me in reading about them. And these women were far from perfect, and they fought with each other, and they disagreed. And one of the fascinating things to me about the suffrage movement is that there were a lot of women against suffrage. Sometimes for reasons, they didn't think women could handle it, and I think, oh yeah, sure. But they had interesting reasons too, where they said, well, our opinions are valued because we're nonpartisan, and if we actually have the vote, that will change. And women were very active. Not as many women who were for the vote, but women were very active towards the end, and the anti-suffragists were very well organized, and mostly women, which surprises me. So there's no monolithic one way of viewing things as women or things like that. But I do wind up really admiring and in the end finding them as role models. I'll tell you what, Ida B. Wells is someone that you'll hear about a lot today, and she was a black suffragist. She was a journalist, and in fact, today we would call her a data-driven journalist. She started putting together the first maps of lynching in the U.S. And she's an example of someone who the white suffragists a lot of times were dismissive and sometimes actively racist against the black suffragists, and that's a hard thing to read about, and it's an issue we still have to deal with and figure out today. How do we make it a more perfect, more fair union? But one of the reasons why she was for suffrage, and she was impressive and strong and fearless. And she said, we need the vote so that we can do something about lynching. We need the vote so that we can protect ourselves. And reading her story has been fascinating. I mean, all of these women, I've admired them and find them as people who are role models, sometimes because they are ordinary. None of them went to Harvard. Nobody said, we're going to come and appoint you this. They just decided that they cared about it and were going to do it. They didn't wait for someone to give them permission. And I think that's a good lesson today. If you care about something, and it doesn't have to be a big issue. It could just be, I think our town needs a new stop sign at this intersection. You can do it. You can make a difference. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to have some stellar resume. You don't have to be anointed. If you see something you think needs to be improved and you can play a role, go ahead. Get started.
One of the things that comes to mind as you're speaking about that, when my son was in kindergarten, one of his classmates was upset because driving to school, he saw that there was a goose had been hit by a car. And it was right along a river, and it was a place where geese are all the time. And it upset him to the point where he wrote a letter to our then Mayor Menino here in Boston. And to this day, 23 years later, there is a goose crossing sign that was put up there because of this young man caring and writing a letter and getting involved.
I love it. That's a wonderful story, and that's exactly how a lot of important change gets started. I think that's one of the things that's so exciting to me is I think this generation of kids coming along, they are involved. They do care. They do want to make a difference, and we just hope that we can give them a couple of good examples to look at as they go out and do great things.
Yeah, I can't end the interview without just asking. I've had this year's been wonderful. I've had a chance to speak with a couple of astronauts for the first time in my life, and speak to the grandson of Jacques Cousteau, who is now an oceanographer himself. This is the first time I've had a chance to speak to somebody of a presidential family. We didn't mention it earlier, but Lucinda is the granddaughter of Lady Bird Johnson, and of course, President LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson. What's it like coming from a family with that kind of history?
Well, I certainly know that I'm extraordinarily lucky and very thankful. It does mean that, sort of our dinner table conversation growing up and the people that I had a chance to be exposed to and learn from, they really believed that they could do great things and that their actions made a difference. And obviously my grandfather was very involved in things like the war on poverty and civil rights legislation. My grandmother was very involved in environmentalism and Head Start. And I think that sense that you can make the world better is something that always sort of seeped through and always heard about. That and the other thing was sort of, always be on your absolute best behavior so you don't reflect badly. But my co-author, Becca Roberts, her grandmother was Lindy Boggs, and her mother was the late, wonderful Cokie Roberts. And she had sort of a similar experience. I think both of us, having grown up in families with a public profile, it makes us particularly aware of how the sausage gets made sometimes, and how and also we're maybe optimists in the sense that we believe good things can happen. We don't think they're going to happen right away. We I think recognize that it's a long, hard, tough slog. But we genuinely believe that we have the ability to constantly improve things, and we think sort of every generation will do that, and they'll come up with new things, and that's fun. And talking with our kids about her boys have also had a chance to maybe hear more about this book than they. I think it's been very interesting for us to see how active and engaged they are.
Yeah. Well, we've had a wonderful time speaking to the co-author of the Suffragist Playbook, Your Guide to Changing the World, Lucinda Robb, and she wrote the book with Becca Roberts. Lucinda, thank you so much for being part of our show.
Oh, this was a blast. Thank you very much.
Please be sure to join us for the next episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. We'll be republishing a beautiful, very powerful interview we did with Nick Stone about her middle grade novel, Dear Martin, in honor of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday. That's the next episode of the podcast. I want to thank the folks who made today's show so wonderful. Of course, I want to thank our guest, Lucinda Robb. Be sure to check out the Suffragist Playbook, your guide to changing the world. Also want to thank my team, Alejandra Doherty, Fatima Khan. I want to thank my beautiful wife for all the support she gives me. But most of all, we want to thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And as always, thank you so very much for taking the time to make the world a better place by reading with your kids. I'll be looking for you in the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast.